want to bring Ted Glick into the conversation, Policy Director of the Chesapeake Climate Action Network. Ted, the global picture right now around climate change and what you think needs to happen as we move from the UN Climate Change Summit to the G20 meeting, and there are also mass protests outside in Pittsburgh, to Copenhagen.
Well, I thought in terms of what happened at the United Nations, one of the underreported presentations was one made by the President Mohammed Nasheed of the Maldives, where he said something to the effect that we come to these conferences, we rail against the injustices, we go back home, things cool off, and the world continues as before. And he's right. It's not that there isn't some change. There certainly are. There's more renewable energy being built and developed in various places around the world, even in the United States. There are changes that are happening, but by and large, given the seriousness and the severity of this crisis and the fact that it's here, this is not something off in the future. The response just is not sufficient, and I have to say I include, when I say that, those who see themselves as progressive activists, as people who care about justice, as people who believe that we need to organize and mobilize to bring about change. Fortunately, there are opportunities this fall for all of us who get it, who are getting it on the severity of this and the immediacy and the urgency of it, to take action. Most immediately, October 24th is an International Day of Action being organized by 350.org. There are literally 115 countries, 1,500 actions all around the world happening on that day. That's a very important action, a very important way to keep building momentum towards Copenhagen. There's civil disobedience, nonviolent civil disobedience happening on November 30th around the world, being organized by the Mobilization for Climate Justice. And then during the Copenhagen talks themselves, in the middle of it, on Saturday, December 12th, is a global day of action being organized by the Global Climate Campaign, the Global Campaign for Climate Action, and many other groups. So there are major opportunities from the grassroots, from below, to bring the kind of pressure that absolutely needs to be brought. There is movement. There has been movement on this issue for years, including in the United States. But it's absolutely time to step it up and to magnify it and intensify it.
And the position of the U.S. Congress and the Obama administration, Ted Glick?
Well, the Obama administration certainly gets the issue in a way that the Bush administration did not. There's no question that some things are happening that are positive. The problem is that the U.S. Congress continues to be a stronghold of coal interests and oil interests. You know, coal and oil has a major stranglehold over Capitol Hill. And again, that's why mobilization is critical. We're not going to solve this problem unless we can break that stranglehold, unless we can get the kind of legislation that really begins to move us seriously off of coal, ends the building of any new coal plants, gets us onto a clean energy trajectory. Again, that won't happen without significant mobilization on a broad scale.
Andrew Refkin from the New York Times, I want to bring you back into the conversation. Can you talk about also why is Copenhagen so important?
Well, if I could briefly just resonate on this point, on the blog lately, I've moved over 20 years from covering the pure science, you know, how much CO2 gets you, how much warming, all that stuff, to what causes change or not. And there's been this phrase that's repeated, and it's on the blog right now, my piece out of the summit. It's called blah, 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 bang. We have this tendency in human nature with a looming slow drip problem like global warming, even in the face of these incremental changes, and most of which are in places we don't pay a lot of attention to while we're insulated ourselves, to let things slide until we get hammered. And the hammer has not fallen yet in any way that has been that kind of wake-up call. Robert Bruhl, who's this sociologist on the blog, sort of deconstructing us, shrinking us, you know, he says we're really... and he points to the activist community, too, and said, you know, this isn't just about lobbying within the Beltway. If you don't have this kind of social awakening in the absence of the big slam from nature, we're not really going to do stuff. And so what I've said, I asked on the blog again, are we still in this blah, 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 bang kind of situation? Can we grow out of that? And it's not clear yet.
I mean, Copenhagen having no carbon emission standards, No requirements, that it's all dropped, the mandates?
Well, India, the reality is, it was really articulated, interestingly enough, by the Bush administration that, what we've got to deal with here is an incredibly variegated set of nearly 200 countries with these entrenched blocks, the have-nots, the haves, the have-too-muches, the getting enough folks, and you're never going to have an agreement. In fact, this has been articulated very clearly lately by Tim Wirth at the UN Foundation and others, that in Copenhagen, the most likely scenario is for sort of a package of fairly modest agreements on specific things like forests or technology sharing, but the big heavy lift of having a global cap and sort of a Kyoto-style system.
Because Kyoto is expiring.
Kyoto is expiring, and the next thing won't be like Kyoto. It'll be something different. That seems to be what everyone is forecasting, meaning not a mandatory ceiling for the globe under which everybody plays nice and trades and people make money and cut emissions. It's not going to. The chances of that coming out within even a few years beyond Kyoto are mixed.
And where does that leave the billions of climate refugees?
Well, one of the issues that there's some hope for an actual concrete commitment in Copenhagen is for actual money to flow to countries with climate vulnerability. It's as you see, Africa, the African Union, Ethiopia, they said they're going to walk out if there isn't a sign of that. And if you look back for 20 years, I've been covering this since the 80s, the first climate treaty in 1992, there were commitments to give poor countries adaptation money, and it never happened in any meaningful way. So if that doesn't happen, that's a starting point, I think. Something for that will likely come.
Well, Andrew Repkin, we want to thank you for being with us, award-winning science reporter for the New York Times, writes the blog .earth over at the Times website. His recent book, The North Pole Was Here, Puzzles and Perils at the Top of the World. Ted Glick, policy director of the Chesapeake Climate Action Network, and Anna Pinto in Pittsburgh, indigenous rights activist from India. And we're